Question: how do you know when a painting is finished? Well, for starters, you're trying to find last details, maybe correct some color balance, and you get to this one point where if you're gonna add any more, you might as well just start a new painting. Anyways, this is how my painting began. Even though there's a cat in the painting, I started out by laying out some lines for the bars of the fence. They are a big part of the painting since they are in the foreground, and in a way, they will act as a roadmap for the rest of the painting and help with the placement of everything from the cat and the rest of the background. Besides laying out the bars, I started to apply some of the highlights and darks. In a way, I was trying to experiment early on with getting a 3D effect of the bars. And I know to make them pop out, highlights and darks will definitely help. And on the far left, there was a series of bars that recede. Because there were not a lot of straight lines, it was in a way tricky to paint. But I kept in mind that this painting was going to be all about imperfections. One of the colors I loved creating for this painting was definitely the fuchsia purple that is visible in the back. It's the main color of the house behind the fence, and there's various tones of it, light and dark. Overall, the color gives a nice sense of serenity, and I got lucky that that was the color of the walls. Even though the cat recedes in the painting, I wanted to pay attention to getting the face down early on, because in my personal opinion, the way the cat looks back at the viewer is probably going to be the strongest point in the end. I'm striving to get a nice sense of eye contact between the cat and the viewer. Since the cat is behind the fence, I had to pay attention to the shadows of the bars and the way they wrapped around the cat. And the areas of the cat that were in the sun, I emphasized the brightness. This involved laying a lot of different tones of color in the fur, cool colors and warm colors, and then doing lots of dry brushing to smooth it out. I didn't go into detail yet with the fur, but I wanted to have a nice sense of shade and sunlight early on. Going back to the cat's face, since it was in the shade, it was a bit tricky to paint. I had to do lots of little gradual changes of shade. I paid very close attention to the photo, and in some ways, I exaggerated a little bit the color to give the face some form. I also was laying out the groundworks of where the whiskers would be. Mind you, this would be one of the last few things I would paint on the cat's face, but I wanted to set where they would be early on, kind of like a guide. The ledge that the cat would be on was going to be one of the brightest things in the painting, so I painted it with titanium white and a hint of orange prior to going into detail. As for the concrete wall below the ledge, I did start to paint some of the cracks. As you can see, I have a dark blue underpainting for the shadow, and that was intentional. When I layer paint over it, some of the blue will come through, and the application of the paint wasn't going to exactly be smoothly brushed on. It was going to be dabs here and there with different variations of brushwork to give it a rough look. I also applied reflective light in certain areas because even in the shade, there's light that bounces off surfaces, and that's very apparent underneath the ledge and part of the concrete that recedes. Plus, there's a sense of roughness that I was capturing early on. Just like the bars, I applied lights and darks to give it a 3D look early on, but this is something that I will go back into later even more. But at this moment, I was just laying out the groundworks for the rest of the wall. Besides the ledge, The plant also casts one as well. I don't remember the count, but I believe I went back into the bars of the fence at least 3 or 4 times. The first time to lay out where they are. The second more so to straighten out the bars by applying some of the color of the background or highlights on the edge or the color of the bar to straighten them. The third time probably to just touch them up and paint them more thoroughly. And the fourth, well, watch later in the video. Behind the fence, parts of the house are visible, mainly the windows. I had trouble deciding on how much to show of them, and you'll see throughout the video, I went back into them several times. Even though it's very dark in the center, one thing you'll notice is it's not pitch black. And the reason that was done is so it could recede more. I didn't want the contrast in the background to overpower the rest of the painting, especially if the goal was to make the bars of the fence look three-dimensional. Besides less contrast, soft edges helped. I applied some color to define the edges of the windows, but I will use a lot of dry brushing to smooth them out. Here I'm starting to begin some of the detail of the fence in the front. Mainly the highlights and darks and painting some of the areas where the paint is starting to chip or bubble. Because of how weathered the paint job is on the fence, there's lots of different tones of gray throughout. And they also cast a little bit of a shadow as well. The application of the paint, just like the concrete, was done in patches to mimic that rough visual look. It's not a glossy finish, that's for sure, or at least it's not anymore. And smooth paint and uniform color will not give it the aged look. Here I'm beginning to go back into the cat. As you can see, I'm defining the fur a little more and adding strokes of light and dark in order to define it. It is very directional and kind of rough at first, but the idea is to apply the right colors and then smooth it out. But most importantly, for the cat to have form and not look flat in the painting. And lights and darks will help carve out the shape and form. I know I mentioned it before, but the look of the cat is definitely going to be what makes this painting. And I did spend a lot of time trying to get those eyes, getting that stare and facial expression of the cat in the photo to be looking directly at the viewer. Just like the body of the cat, same thing with the face. Lights and darks to carve out the shape and form, but in a much more gradual way. Because the cat's in the shade, since there's not much visible light, I had to be very delicate and in some ways exaggerate some of the darks and carefully paint in a way where the brushwork would show some definition on the face. Going back to the ledge underneath the cat, I started to apply some of the texture on the side and looked very carefully at the photo, but this is just an experimental stage. Later in the video, I will go back into that ledge even more. Painting the plant was quite a tedious task to do, and it took actually longer to paint it than the cat itself. I actually did a whole video on how to paint leaves. It's a very slow video, and for the most part I show step by step how I painted this plant. If interested, check it out. But the message behind the whole process is lay out the skeleton of the plant, which is the vines and major leaves that stand out, and mind the edges of the leaves. Plus use darks and lights to make certain leaves recede or stand out, and edges. Sharp ones to bring things forward and dull ones to make things recede. Plus all the little detail, such as the veins on the leaves, the roundness of the vines, and little folds and highlights. And the leaves even have ridges and are not smooth. Here I'm going back into the bars of the fence, and I believe it's the last time, at least for the far left, All I'm doing in this situation is just straightening the lines, blurring some of the edges, and making them more bluish purple so they can recede into the background more. As mentioned earlier, these bars are also not exactly straight. I don't know why, but in the photo they appear that way. Yes, I started painting the background of the house again because I was not quite happy with the rough look of the paint. In order for it to recede more, I felt a smoother form of the fuchsia will push it back. This also gave me the opportunity to go back into some of the edges and smooth them out a little more, especially since this is the background and I wanted it to recede more. The highlights of the fence up close are very rough, and there's even little cracks and crevices among them, and I wanted to make sure I painted them. There's also rust forming from areas where the paint is chipping, especially underneath on the bottom of the main bigger bar. I figured since this is so up close to the viewer, more detail would make it stand out. That included everything from painting more highlights and applying some darker color where the light and dark meet. That way those corners and edges popped out more. I didn't copy every imperfection exactly like the photo. A lot of it I made up. I did pick and choose some of the ones I liked more though, but in the end, I was just trying to give an impression of an aged look of the paint job. Another interesting area that I was painting was the weld marks. In ways, these weld marks show how the bars connect to the rest of the fence. They're not that visible because they're hiding in the shadows casted by the bars, but I wanted to give an impression of them. Plus they bulge out a little and a bit round too. Again, I'm going back into the bars. This time I'm actually brightening the sides where the sun is actually hitting them, so they stand out more from the background. And of course, I would apply detail later. One thing I do to paint shadows is to have a defining edge where I darken it, and then have another defining edge where it's very bright, and then I dry brush in between to smooth things out. That way there's a nice transition between shadow and light. And this is where I go back into the ledge. The paint application is a lot thicker since it's bright. I'm also painting lots of little dots and lines because the ledge has that kind of texture. In the photo, it actually is more pronounced, but I did blur it more so it's not too much of an eyesore versus the cat itself. But the idea was to give the impression of the texture from the side of the ledge. And this is the section that I made a whole video about, how to paint plants and leaves. Definitely check it out if you want to see in detail how I did it. Warning, it's a long video, but I tried to explain every step I took and the colors I used to pull it off. Plus some of the illusionary techniques to make some of the leaves stand out and some to get pushed back into the background. I do want to point out that I didn't copy this plant leaf for leaf, but I did want to do a good job to have something in a way kind of like a counterweight to the cat. Even though this is a small section of the painting, but it's funny how it took up the most time in the end. Originally, I did have the thought of extending the leaves even more and inventing more vines, plus adding a plant below. But I thought about the photo I used and why I chose it, and in some ways, if I went too much against the photo, I would ruin what made it special in the first place, the simplicity of just a cat and a sliver of a plant. One thing I did like about this photo was how there's two different types of ledges, one thicker than the other. Something about this imperfection caught my eye, and in some ways all the other imperfections, like the bars that are not straight, give it, in a way, some character, typical of an old Greek village. One of the areas I struggled in decision making was how much detail to include in the bottom part below the ledge. Part of me wanted to go all out. There are quite a lot of crevices and imperfections, and another part of me wanted to go light because I didn't want to cause a distraction from the rest of the painting. I guess my solution was meeting both goals halfway. But one thing I did want to capture are the many different colors I saw. Thanks to the reflective light, the shadow was quite fun to paint, especially below the ledge. And then there was all the cracks. If you look carefully, I always would do some little highlights where the edges are. That way they stand out. But I would always also dry brush so they're not an annoyance either. And some of the cracks were wet on wet, so they have a softer appearance because the sun does, in ways, blur them naturally. I know artists like to have trademarks in their work, and one of the trademarks I have been developing slowly is a sense of detail in the negative space. To clarify what I'm trying to say, even though this is a cat painting, there's a lot of other things in it too, such as the concrete wall below the ledge, the metal bars of the gate, and also the background. And the way I attack something like this is with equal level of importance. Yes, the cat in the end will definitely be the star of the show, but I also like capturing as much detail everywhere else. I felt like I had to say that. Oh, and my signature is around here as well. If you haven't checked out my video of an alternative way to sign your art, definitely check it out. In the video, I was trying to decide where to hide it in this painting, and I made my decision underneath the ledge. Another area I had conflict in at least deciding what to do was the very bottom. Initially I was just going to leave it very dark, but I decided towards the end to lighten it up. The idea was to create more attention in the center, but I wasn't liking the look. And for some reason the concrete wall below there was even more rougher. But I did paint it softly so it doesn't become an eyesore or a distraction from the rest of the painting. The process involved laying out a foundation color, then applying some lights, then applying some darks, then the highlights in the darks and the lights, and then dry brushing to smooth things out. The last thing I would want is someone to stare only at the bottom, so the goal was not to make it too distracted. No, do not adjust your phone or TV screen or monitor. I don't know how you're watching my video, but yes, I am painting upside down. Sometimes it's a good way to get areas where you might have difficulty doing if it's right side up. This is not the only painting where I do this. Check out my baby portrait. At one point I flipped the canvas so I could work at the face in a different way. Yes, the cat is definitely the star in the end, especially the look on its face. But I did want to go back into the fur. I felt it was too rough. Also the contrast where the shadow was hitting it, I felt it was too pale. So I went back into it and looked at the photo more carefully and tried to add more definition. Again, I just laid out colors, several strokes here and there, and then I would go back with a dry brush to smooth things out. And to add some final touches, I would add some variations into the fur so they stood out more. Nothing makes something pop out more than light and dark next to each other. And then there's the nose of the cat. I felt it needed to be boosted a little since it's dead in the center of the face. That way it could draw more attention, especially to the eyes. And more cracks and imperfections. Towards the end, I think I just tried looking for more to do. It's kind of awkward and hard to sometimes finish a painting. There's so much detail sometimes you want to capture, and so little time, and sometimes you're limited by the size of the canvas. I had all those issues, but I still wanted to go back into it, especially the reflective light and the edging. But some of the little detail I was trying to catch particularly were little pieces of rock that had kind of chipped away, but are still hanging to the rest of the concrete wall. But as stated in the beginning, you come to a point where you realize, what more can you do? I believe this is the final time I go back into the bars. I think I was going for some more imperfections, little grooves where the highlights are, and little dings where the edges meet. As you can see, I am using a stretcher to brace my hand. For one, it keeps it steady, but also it prevents my hand from smudging wet paint. And believe it or not, rust has texture, so I went back into it and hit it with some more brighter tones of yellowish orange and some darks, because it did look kind of flat. And I was tipped off by my fiance to make that one piece of paint chip to stand out a little more. And this is where the painting comes to an end. The final details on the bottom right. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. This video did take some time to make. I usually break down videos into episodes, but I said to myself, why not try to make one from beginning to end? Hopefully you liked it and found some value from it. Anyhow, once again, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob. I am not your typical painter. Oh, and check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course, if you want to see more of my work.